abordamos de modo bastante introdutório as questões de desastres climáticos que aconteceram nos Estados Unidos, com um especialista que está também na live de hoje, David Dodd. Ele é CEO e é também fundador do ISRC, que é um centro de excelência internacional para a resiliência sustentável, International Sustainable Infrastructure Center. E ele está conosco para tratar hoje, de modo mais específico, do passo a passo, de um dos desastres climáticos acontecidos nos Estados Unidos, que tem mais similaridade com o que aconteceu no Rio Grande do Sul, que são as enchentes, as inundações que ocorreram em Louisiana em 2016. O David também esteve à frente desse evento climático e da recuperação do estado de Louisiana em 2016. Na live anterior, nós falamos bastante a respeito do Katrina, né, da catástrofe que envolveu Katrina, como naquele momento o Estado estava aprendendo ainda o que deveria ser feito em termos de resposta, como também em termos de recuperação, e depois, já em 2016, com a lição aprendida na época do Katrina, como eles puderam se desenvolver. Então, por meio de uma apresentação, inclusive, que vai estar aqui no início da nossa live, o David vai trazer para nós muito desse passo a passo de como hoje, nos Estados Unidos, não só o processo de resposta rápido, mas principalmente o processo de recuperação de longo prazo, ele é endereçado. E também está conosco a Ana Paula Santos, Ana Paula de Almeida Santos, que também, além de querida amiga, ela é diretora de sustentabilidade da CNSEG, da Confederação Nacional de Seguros. E é um setor que está tendo um impacto muito importante com essa catástrofe, vai tratar disso, é um setor que corresponde a 6% do PIB nacional e está enfrentando uma situação que, na catástrofe, né, na dimensão que está acontecendo, está realmente exigindo que esse setor repense, reflita, verifique como é que vai encarar esse assunto. Então, tal qual na live passada, nós estamos nessa live com 2 links. Um link em português, com a tradução em português simultânea, e um link para o inglês. Isso está na descrição do vídeo aqui embaixo. Quem quiser acompanhar a live em inglês, que é a língua que nós vamos falar aqui. E também deixar, por fim, o convite a você que está nos ouvindo para se inscrever para o BIA, tá? O Brazilian Initiative for Infrastructure Resilience and Adaptation. É uma iniciativa brasileira que nós estamos trazendo, nós estamos formando no Brasil e que, junto com a ISRC, vai pensar melhor sobre infraestrutura resiliente, sobre adaptação. Nós estamos recebendo os e-mails, os formulários daqueles que estão se inscrevendo no site do BIA, www.biabr.com, para que possam vir a se tornar membros. Nós já estamos iniciando as nossas atividades. Então, fica nosso convite para você acessar o site e se tornar um membro do BIA. Então, já iniciando a nossa live and switching into English. So welcome, David. Welcome,
Ana Paula. It's a pleasure to have both of you here. And I think we're going to have a very, very good conversation today about recovery, about disasters, and how do we deal with it. So welcome, Ana Paula, please.
Hi everyone. Nice to speak with you again, Natasha, and nice to meet you, David. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight, and even though we are facing so tragic moment here in Brazil, and we are really rethinking and so about everything that is what climate change can really impact a society. But before to continue, I just want to give again, and more once, our solidarity to people of the Rio Grande do Sul. Our sympathies, our prayers, and our really hoping to that this situation can finish as long as possible.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Ana Paula. Of course, and what we're trying to do here is to bring all of our solidarity and try to think with strategy and with intelligence in order to prevent new disasters, at least not the, to face the consequences, the hard consequences that we're facing now, and also to adapt the infrastructure and everything that is already there in order to adapt for this kind of disasters, because the forecast is that we will keep having this kind of situation. And David, please.
It's a real pleasure to be once again speaking with you, Natasha and Ana Paula. It's a real pleasure to meet you. I'm very attuned to the plight of the insurance industry worldwide because of the continued increase in number and intensity of disasters. And I too send my prayers and thoughts to all of the citizens that have been affected by these terrible floods. And that's what we're going to hopefully talk about today, and maybe give some people some reason to have hope that recovery can happen, and recovery in a better way, so that there is resilience built into the recovery.
So one thing that was very clear in our last conversation last Tuesday was that when Katrina hit the United States, you were not properly prepared. And then in 2016, in these Louisiana floods, you had already the preparation that could lead to less consequences, at least a better recovery of the state. So we're talking now about this step by step during this second. I will not say second event, because there were many other events during these 10 years between these two events. But how was that a better example in what you do whenever this kind of tragedy happens?
It's funny to think about this, Natasha, because you sent me an article. I think it was last Tuesday, the day of the interview. Very critical of taking the approach that the U.S. took after Katrina for this tragedy. And I told you what I said. I was one of the biggest critics of that recovery, because I was involved from the perspective of the state of Louisiana, and the federal agencies did a very poor job of coordinating. They were totally uncoordinated. They were saying different things out of different agencies. So that led President Obama at the time to issue a presidential executive order that it's called a directive to establish a better way to ensure that agencies work together, that they're coordinated, and they speak with a single voice. So under the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is, as many people have heard of, FEMA in the U.S., the agencies of the federal government all were coordinated under 6 recovery support functions. So those 6 functions had, each one of those was led by an agency, and then had several coordinating agencies along with that lead agency. So that really organized recovery in a way it had never been organized before. So that was originally used in 2011, and then it was used. Many of you have heard of Superstorm Sandy, which flooded New York City. It was used there, and by the time 2016 happened, these floods in Louisiana, it was not a well-oiled machine. There's no such thing in the federal government, especially in the U.S. I'm not speaking of Brazil. I'm speaking of the U.S. as a well-oiled machine, but it worked, and it was working well. And I will tell you that as you know, my specialty although I've done all types of recovery and resilience. My specialty is economic resilience, and the economic recovery support function, they're all called recovery support function. The economic one had, by the end of that recovery, had worked with every other one of the recovery support functions. So we were literally working together, and that's a huge change from Katrina.
David, so we're putting our presentation just now, but before that, one thing that is very important is that we learn from our mistakes. So could you please let us know regarding Katrina, you already told about coordination was an issue, but could you tell us more about the mistakes in Katrina recovery? What was done that should not be done again?
There were many things. The one thing that struck me most was because of this discoordination. There were at one point New Orleans had three huge recovery planning efforts going on at the same time, and they were duplicating each other. And the governor of the state and the secretary of economic development asked me to go down there and find out what was going on. So I did, and I saw these three efforts working not with each other at all. They were all working independently, and people were confused. And I went back and I said to the governor, I said, Governor Kathleen Blanco, God rest her soul, wonderful person. I said, there's only one thing you can do is tell them that if they don't come together, they're not going to get any more recovery. And so that led to the unified plan, which brought all of these planning efforts together. And that worked. But again, it took outside intervention. And that's one of many things. I could speak all night about things that happened. But the thing that's important, I think, to focus on is that out of these issues and these problems came positive change. And no recovery is perfect, Natasha. This recovery won't be perfect, but positive things can come out of this to make Brazil better prepared for the next major catastrophe. And we hope it never happens, but we know better. It's going to happen sooner or later. So that's what I would say in response to your question.
So when you say these difficulties, how long did it take to get all of these people, all of these levels of administration together in order to go to look at the same to the same point, to the same result, to the same goal?
Well, at the larger, which I'd rather deal at the larger level, the presidential directive came as a result of everyone saying we have to do something better. We have to do something different. We must have coordination and collaboration. Another very important point. The agencies need to be able to work together, but there had to be a framework developed to do that. So that's why they call it the National Disaster Recovery Framework, because that's what it was. It was a framework that allowed the agencies to have very clear direction on where they would work, how they would work together, and it's laid out in the presentation, which we're, I guess, going into right now.
Yes. So the presentation, it's important to speak. It's going to be in English and in Portuguese, but David, you can just keep going. The English part of it is there. Okay.
Great. Okay. Next slide, please. We have the next slide. Oh, okay. Sorry. I didn't know if they could hear me.
Yeah.
So in 2016, in March and August, in March, we had 1,000-year flood. Now, what that means is not a flood that happens every 1,000 years. That's a common misunderstanding. What it means is that in any given year, there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that a flood will occur. We had 2 of those within 6 months. And those 2 events were catastrophic, flooded 80% of the states of the land in the state of Louisiana. The March event was in north and central Louisiana, which is primarily rural. So there weren't as many homes damaged, although there were significant damages, including a major port, an inland port in North Louisiana that was inoperable for almost a month. And you can imagine the economic damage that occurred because goods are not able to move up and down that river. But the one in August was more impactful because it was in an area of much higher population. And that affected 146,000 homes, and damages were over $10 billion. And
David,
yeah,
when you say damages in $10 billion, you're saying the direct losses, right? You're not saying about the economic problem. What do you mean by $10 billion
that's a
losses?
very, very important point. When we say damages, that is direct physical damage to buildings, homes, infrastructure, businesses. What's not calculated in damages is the total impact. And I told you this, I think, last week, but let's say it again because it's so important. The number one cause of economic damage in a disaster is not direct damage to the physical environment, the built environment, businesses, homes. The number one cause of economic loss is interruption of business, interruption of services, interruption of the lives of people. That's the number one damage. So thank you for asking that question because it's very important that people understand. They say worldwide that economic damages are about 300 to 400 billion dollars a year, depending on the year. But that's where they're at now, around four. But that is direct damage. The impact, and the United Nations Disaster Office of Disaster Risk Reduction just made a post about this. The impact, the total impact, is well over $1 trillion. That's a percent, 1.2, 1.3% of total economic output globally. So that's the cost that we're paying right now for disasters. So the August event was again so impactful that because of the amount of rainfall that fell in 2 days, 7.1 trillion gallons, and a gallon is about 4 liters. 7.1 trillion gallons of water, 3 times as much water as Katrina put into Louisiana. And the governor estimated that he had his scientists estimate, the governor of the state said that the Mississippi River, which is the Amazon of the U.S., it's the largest river, it's the longest river. There's a lot of comparisons, although the Mississippi is unfortunately used way too much for commercial traffic. But the point is, 21 days of that river flowing into the Gulf of Mexico, that's the amount of water. And that river's a mile wide here where I am in New Orleans, at the southern part of the river. So the sheer magnitude of that had never been experienced in the United States ever. So I can understand. I'm not there. I can't empathize. I can't experience what you're going through in Brazil, but I absolutely know from my own I was here when the August flood happened. I was in the state capitol, saw my own car was I was unable to go anywhere for 3 days because my own car was in off. So I understand that aspect, and there were almost 200 people killed in that flood in August of 2016. Next slide.
David,
Yes.
So people think a lot when you think about disasters. First thing that we remember is Katrina, regarding Louisiana. But Katrina was not as devastating as these floods. Am I right?
Katrina
In
was
terms,
no, Katrina was more devastating because the city of New Orleans and the city of New Orleans was not affected by these floods. That's the ironic thing. The thing that is of great, almost, it's not humorous, but it's almost like, okay, New Orleans and the municipalities along the coast were not affected by this. This was all inland. But in Katrina, New Orleans the damage was so great because New Orleans is below sea level. So if water comes in, the only way for you to get it out is to pump it out. And it's protected by barriers called levees that surround the city. And Katrina caused two of those to break, and water gushed in and it had nowhere to go. So the damage was greater in Katrina, although again, the hurricane itself did not put as much water onto Louisiana from rainfall. It caused that major flood, and there was nowhere for the water to go. So by the time the city dried, some of those places had been underwater for 2 or 3 weeks. So that's why it was so catastrophic. And so it's really important, Natasha, to understand these differences because different events have different impacts. And knowing that and looking for where are the vulnerabilities, where are there areas that are subject to flooding, and what can we do to protect those areas? Those are the lessons that we want to take from any time there's a tragedy. We want to take those lessons and be able to apply them in the future. Here are some photos of the damage. As you can see, this is the August flood. You can see it was really catastrophic. So what we talked about this. We talked about the National Disaster Recovery Framework.
when was that about the framework? When did the framework
it was first
released?
implemented in 2011.
Okay.
That's when it was first implemented. So
And this is a national framework. It's work for every U.S. State.
This was due to a presidential directive, an order from the president to coordinate all of the agencies, again, working under the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So all of these agencies were assigned, every federal agency was assigned to one of 6 recovery support functions. And those were economic, community planning, and capacity building. Economic was under the Economic Development Administration. There were 11 other agencies that we worked with under that umbrella of the Economic Recovery Support Function. Community planning and capacity building, that was under the Federal Emergency Management Agency itself. And that was for communities to do pre-disaster recovery planning so that before the next disaster, there are already plans and mechanisms in place for recovery. That's so important. The third one is housing, which is under the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. That covers residential, structures, shelter. That's what that covers. Go ahead, Natasha. I'm sorry.
No. I think we have a slide that is detailing all of these points, but just to go back a little bit, so the National Disaster Recovery Framework, it was a response that started in Katrina, and it was implemented only 6 years later. So it took 6 years to develop this framework. Is that it, more or less?
The directive was not issued until 2009.
Okay.
And that's because in 2008, a new president was elected. Okay. So that's how that happened. And so it actually took only 2 years. to actually draft it, have it approved, and start to implement. So again, this is in response to that, and it is to try to improve the function of the federal government in recovery. Now we'll talk in a moment. If we can go to the next slide, I think that would be great. So we can
Okay.
talk.
I just want, I don't know if you're going to talk this further, but in order to treat this framework, so the trigger is appointed by the president, as I understand. So he's the one that, called the framework to start to work. Is that how it works?
The way it works in the U.S., that's a very, 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 very important point, Paul. The way it works in the United States is, again, because we are a democratic republic. So the states are where everything starts, right? They all start at the state level. So the governor must request a disaster declaration. Once the declaration is approved and the response, and it's very important to and this chart really does a fair job of showing these different stages. Response is, our heroes are the first responders. They're the ones that run into the buildings when everyone's running out. That is response. And response is the saving of lives, the dealing with the emergency at hand, right, when a disaster strikes. So after the response, as the response is starting to take effect, then we start to look at how do we start the process of recovering and rebuilding from this, okay? So as you can see on this chart, this is a chart that was developed by FEMA. It's used widely all over the world. So the most important thing is preparedness. But when a disaster strikes, then there's the response, that's short term, that's days and maybe a couple of weeks. Then there's the intermediate phase where you're still doing response, but you're starting to look at the elements of recovery. And then there's long-term recovery, which can take months or even years. In Puerto Rico, which was completely destroyed by 2 hurricanes that hit within a month, the recovery operation took 3.5 years for most agencies. For the economic recovery, it took 5 years. So long-term recovery means just that. It's moving from stabilizing to rebuilding, reconstructing, and implementing, integrating resilience into all of that. Next
And
slide.
David,
Yes.
David, it's very good that you're saying this again, and this slide shows it. There is an important difference between response and recovery, and this slide shows it. What is the difference between this response and recovery? Recovery is totally long term. It starts in the first day. It starts together with response, but response goes until one point, and then recovery keeps going. So it's important to think it's like a dual track, right? Both goes.
They call this chart lovingly. They call this chart the 3-humped camel, because there's response, the intermediate stage, which is where response and recovery come together, and then recovery. So this is the slide that's really important, because this shows that we were already in the middle of a recovery operation when the second flood occurred, which was totally unpredicted. So we were working on the recovery from the March flooding when the August flooding occurred. So what they did is they said, okay, we have to have a separate declaration. Every disaster is numbered in the US, and they begin with DR, which is disaster recovery, the number, and then the abbreviation of the state. So this was DR 4416 LA. But the important point is that these 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 support functions operate on a set of principles, and that is so important. And it starts with the recovery support. I mean the mission scoping assessment, as we call it. That is an assessment of the damages, of the impacts, what happened, what was damaged, who was affected, what what was the outcome of this, and that serves as the foundation for developing recovery strategies. So the first set of documents is the mission scoping. The second is the recovery support strategies. And the word support is so important because we operate the recovery operations in the U.S. by the federal government operate under one guiding principle, and it's called local primacy. And what that means is that the local stakeholders, the people that were affected, their representatives, their leaders, are where we get our direction. We don't go in and prescribe something. We don't say, well, we wouldn't think you should do this, this, and this. No, we go in and we listen. We listen first. We find out where the pain is. We find out what needs to be done in all of these different areas, from healthcare to housing to infrastructure to economics to natural and cultural resources, which are very, very important. I know that in Brazil. So what we do in the U.S. is we say let's listen. We have what we call listening sessions, and we actively listen, and we take that and we combine that with the data that we've gathered, with the information that we've gathered, and we come back and we say, okay, you said this. What do you think about this? We never say you should do this. Never. We say, what do you think about this? Do you think this would work for you?
David,
That
one thing
way,
that got my
yeah.
attention, sorry about that.
No,
Sorry
go
for
ahead.
the interruption. One thing that got my attention was that in the previous slide, it was you pointed that it was a state and federal strategy together, okay? But then how do you go to the municipalities, to the cities, to the mayors? They are not, they are in the strategy, but they are not part of the framework, right?
They are the leaders of the framework.
Good.
That's what I'm saying.
It's
What I'm
very
saying
important.
is
Yeah.
we are not there to impose the federal government on any state, any municipality, any city, any community, anyone. We are there to assist. We are there to help, to provide our expertise, experience, the resources that can be brought to bear from the federal government to enable recovery, robust, what we call robust recovery, resilient recovery. And that's a very important point, Natasha. Absolutely.
David, we will have elections for this level here in Brazil for municipalities, for mayors in October. And do you have any kind, in your experience, of you have anything to say regarding elections during disaster recovery? If it impacts, how do you see that in your expertise? Any situation where elections were suspended or stuff like this?
We had, during this flood recovery, we had a federal election. We had a change in presidents. And that change, although it was a completely different, we went from President Obama to President Trump, totally completely different. But that did not affect the recovery. That has been our experience. And at the state level, we had new governors elected during recovery. Again, did not affect in a material way, did not affect the recovery. And part of the reason for that is that in recovery, when a tragedy occurs, people tend to put aside their differences, even if they're great differences, and focus on the people that are affected and the people that are hurt and the people that need help. So that's been the experience, not only in the U.S. but other places that I've worked. We had the same thing happen in Mexico when I was working an earthquake recovery, and the recovery itself was not affected. Okay, so can we go to the next slide?
So these are the functions that you were saying.
Right, and,
I
and
said
I
that
was
we
I
would.
think I was at housing. Then we have infrastructure, we have cultural natural resources, and we have health and social services. And you can see under that each one of those is led by an agency, and then they have partnering agencies that are under them. When I say under them, it's not that they dictate what the other agencies are going to do. They all work together. They're all meant to work together. And in the Louisiana floods, uh, our recovery support function, the Economic Development Administration, and our partner agencies within the economic recovery support function, we worked with every one of these other recovery functions, every single one. And in Puerto Rico, we did the same thing. So that is a part and parcel of the way this is structured. And it's so that you have that collaboration, you have that coordination. You have people all saying the same thing instead of saying different things.
So, David, these areas, so we're saying each department that was responsible for each area. These are all federal departments, federal agencies, or?
They are all federal agencies.
Okay.
They are all under the federal government, but each one of these agencies works with their comparable state agencies. So, for example, in Louisiana, we worked very closely with the Louisiana Department of Economic Development. That's the state agency. We worked hand in hand with them. In fact, they came and had representatives in our recovery office every day because that's how close they wanted to work with us and we wanted to work with them. So that's
But
the that's the way
but the,
that's the way that's the way and the reason, Natasha, let me finish this
of
one
course.
statement. The reason this is important is because in the recovery apparatus of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, there is funding that comes with that. The Federal Emergency Management Agency provides individual assistance to individuals that are affected, and they provide public assistance to communities. In the U.S., we have counties, sub-state governments, and the agencies themselves, the Economic Development Administration, Housing and Urban Development, they all can provide some level of funding to help as well. The state and local stakeholders know that. So they want to work with the federal agencies. So it's not a situation where we come in and we say, well, you have to work with this. They want to work. They want to work with the federal agencies. And that's a
But the
really important
decision,
component.
They want and they need to work, right?
yeah.
Because their resources came from the federal level normally, right?
The majority in disaster recovery do. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, that's not to say that states don't play a role themselves in recovery. And I again, I don't pretend to know how things work politically in Brazil, but in the United States, it often depends on the state. Many of you have heard of Texas. Texas is unique in the United States. It's the only state that was at one point a country in of itself. So they are very independent. And Texas normally will take some federal assistance, but then they'll say, we're fine. See you later. We're okay. Now, other states that don't have that spirit of independence and we'll do it ourselves gladly accept federal assistance. So it's not a uniform situation across the United States. And again, It's a republic, so that makes it a little, a little
Different, right?
unique. Yeah.
But David, and then regarding decision making, so it's of course states must work together with federal government, federal agencies, but then who has the final word, or is it like a collective decision? How is that?
The stakeholders, the people representing the area, the business representation of the area that's been affected, the local elected officials and appointed officials, citizens, they all are the final decision makers. Again, we don't go and say, here's what you need to do. We say, here are some possible solutions. We ask first, remember, and then we say, here's some possible solutions. And they make the choice. They choose what they want to do. That is the bedrock principle of the National Recovery Framework.
It's like a crisis committee, appointed by the state or the city, in order to address and respond to the framework, right?
What we do is we find the organizations that represent these different interests, right? And we work through the organizations and we meet with the individual business owners, we meet with the individual healthcare providers, we meet with the individual housing developers, so that we are dealing directly with the people that were affected, and we find out what it is they would like to see based on ideas that we develop because of our experience. Does that make sense?
Yep,
Yes.
total sense.
Great. No, it's not. It's not easy. I mean, it's not. It's not
Yeah,
simple. It's not simple. But recovery's not simple. When
exactly.
you look at a state like your state that's completely flooded, you're like, wow, how do we address something this significant, this large, this massive? You do it one step at a time, and having a framework, having a process. Now, let me make something clear to everyone. Please do not think that I am sitting here saying, well, this is what Brazil needs to do. Brazil needs to do what's best for Brazil. This is just simply to share this information and give you some ideas from a very, very similar disaster, what was done to help with the recovery and help make the state more resilient.
No, I think this is very clear, David. Like we are sharing here an experience and trying to learn from it. So these are in this next slide, we have this guiding principles. And I just want to let you know that it's written 8 guiding principles, but during our our translation moment, the first principle is not here, and it seems to be a very important principle as individual and family empowerment. So please go, David, to let us
Again,
know more
it
about
goes
these
back.
principles.
The power goes back to the people. Power to the people. That is absolutely bedrock principle. And state leadership and local primacy. That's what have been talking about for the last 10 or 15 minutes. But it's so important because that is the bedrock of, that is again the foundation of successful recovery. Then there's pre-disaster recovery planning, which we've already spoken about. There's engaged partnerships, and again, this is really important that all of this be inclusive. All of these be inclusive of populations that may not always be asked to participate. We want everyone at the table. We want all groups at the table. And then unity of effort, that goes back. Unity of effort goes back to the reason the framework was created. Someone had a
This
comment.
now, this is so important what you're saying. What the thing that Rio Grande do Sul is facing right now, it's so long. It's a so long disaster, and the need of the population changes every day. So that's why, make totally sense when you say that when you have a framework, when you have a recovery plan, such like that, you give to the people, the ability and the power to really to be able to say, this is what we need now. Now we need water. Now we need clothes. Now we need blankets. Now we need money. Now we need jobs. So they understand and they know immediately what they need that they have at this moment. It's just really is a really powerful word, and I say like counseling that you're giving us right now.
And then,
Well,
Nepal, I think it's even more than that, because it's taking ownership of the decisions, right, David? So they
Exactly.
feel it's for them, it's for the victims, and it's also for the state, and it's also for the country. It's for us. And so it's for the communities that really take the ownership and the decision that they're doing. So it's for them, right, David?
Exactly.
no, and you are exactly right, and you said something extremely important: ownership. If the stakeholders, the local leaders, the local citizens, everyone, they must own this. This must be theirs, because what happens after the we all leave? What happens after we shut down the recovery effort? If they don't have ownership, then the chances of success long term are next to zero. That is so important, and I'm so glad you brought that up. So that again is one of the foundational principles, that local leadership, local citizens must own the recovery. It must be theirs. That's why we can't dictate it. If we dictate it, it's never there. So going back to the guiding principles, timeliness and flexibility, this is not a straight line. Anyone that thinks that recovery is a straight line, I'm sorry, it's not. You have ups and downs. You have to make adjustments. Things change during recovery, during the period of recovery. You have to adjust to that. Resilience and sustainability. Building resilience into recovery, building sustainability into recovery. Those are bedrock principles as well. Those are so important, especially given where we are with the climate. So the reason my nonprofit is called the International Sustainable Resilience Center, it was originally just the International Resilience Center, and we realized early on that we have to implement resilience in a sustainable way. And the reason is they're interconnected. You cannot have sustainability without resilience, and you cannot have resilience without sustainability. If you have to continually rebuild infrastructure, if you have to continually rebuild homes and businesses because you're not
That's not
investing in
sustainable.
resilience, that is not sustainable.
Yeah. So it's about cost, it's about time, it's about many things. When you talk about resilience, of course you're talking about sustainability. So it's both
Exactly.
of them have to be on the table.
And the last one is probably the one that unfortunately is still most overlooked. The psychological toll of disasters is immense, and it is a huge cost to society. After Katrina, 2/3, 5 years after Katrina, 2/3 of parents of children that were directly in the path of Katrina had sought psychological help for their children. We
What
cannot
kind
overlook that.
what kind of psychological harm? And I think it takes a generation possibly to overcome it.
There were all types of traumatic, symptoms, right? From being scared, from having nightmares, and that's one
Even
reason.
listen to the sounds of some raining or something, right?
Exactly.
This
So
can trigger a lot of panic situations and
exactly. That's trauma. When you go through a disaster like the one that that happened where you are, that is trauma. That is like, that's similar to going through an accident, right? An auto accident, something like that. And so that has to be addressed in recovery. Those issues need to be addressed. And health and social services, that's the agency. Health and Human Services is the federal agency, but that recovery support function is about physical well-being, but it's also about mental well-being. So important. Next slide. This just shows the amount of the state that was damaged. The areas in gray were the areas that were not declared as disasters. They all
David.
received rain throughout the state. There was rain, but the declaration is based on the number of people affected, the amount of damages that were incurred, and a combination of those two things with the boundaries that are around the federal disaster declaration statutes.
Okay, so we made a possibly a not accurate translation, and it's important for you to clarify what parish means here, because as far as I
Parishes, every
understood,
one of those, Natasha, every one of those, I'm leaning up at the screen and pointing like you can see me. Every one of those outlined areas, those are sub-state public entities. So a parish is in the United States and every other state but Louisiana, they're called counties. Why are they called parishes in Louisiana? Because Louisiana is 80% Catholic. And that is, Louisiana was settled by French. It's French Catholic. So that's why they're called parishes in Louisiana. But they're sub-state entities.
Okay.
Okay, so these counties, they were the red one, the yellow ones, the green ones, the blue ones, and the gray ones. They were all
No, the gray ones weren't. The gray ones were not.
The gray ones, no. Okay. So the gray, the green, the yellow, and the blue, they are all the counties, the parishes that received aid, financial aid, and all kinds of aid.
Exactly. The ones in green were the worst sufferers because they were declared for both disasters.
Okay.
Really sad.
For the Katrina and the floods.
No, Katrina. No. There were two floods. Katrina happened.
Just the floods. They are affected by the floods.
Yeah, this is just the floods. Katrina happened 11 years earlier. Okay. This is just the floods. But the thing that's interesting to people from Louisiana is those entities, those counties, parishes closest to the coast that are normally affected by hurricanes weren't affected by this. That's what was so strange about it. But it just shows you the level of impact in this state. Next slide. So this was a step that we always take. What we always do is we identify the most important organizations that we need to be partnering with in recovery. So we identify those based on, again, their relation to our particular function, right? We're economics. So we chose the Department of Economic Development, the Association of Business and Industry. That is a very universal process. We did the same thing in Japan after the earthquake and tsunami in Japan.
David, so what we're talking right now is not only the public policies, the public sector action here, but how did they manage to bring private sector to the recovery? Is that it?
It's all about public-private partnerships. And I'm not talking about public-private partnerships that build roads. I'm talking about public-private partnerships that build leverage and ability to move more quickly in recovery to accomplish more. That is the foundation of successful recovery. Yes. So the way that the state of Louisiana approached this is they said, okay, let's bring everyone together. Let's see what we can do from the state's perspective. So they brought together state, regional, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, local partners, and they had a meeting and they decided to draft interagency operating agreements between state agencies. Then they structured those agreements to address the priorities to to meet the governor of the state who issued an executive order requiring public and private partnerships whenever possible. So Louisiana said, well, we're basically modeling the national recovery framework. So they were the first state in the nation to adapt at the state level the same framework that was being used at the federal level. And we believe that that was a very, very important step toward the effectiveness of the recovery. Next slide. So this is just a little information on the economic recovery support function. Each one of the recovery support functions has its own mission, has its own coordination effort, and the economic recovery support function also engaged 10 state agencies led by the state economic development department. But other agencies within the state were also engaged in the economic recovery. Department of Transportation played a critical role, and we'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay. So David, what you're saying is that we had that 6 areas that we showed in the beginning, and one of these areas was the economic perspective for the recovery, right? So, and now
That's
you're talking
exactly
about this recovery support function, and how did you deal with it, right?
exactly. And the point here is that is the recovery support function that I work under, that I worked this disaster under. But every one of the other 5 recovery support functions does the same exact thing for their specific area, right? For transportation, for health, for natural and cultural resources, right? They all go through the same process, and they all have a mission. They all have their own efforts, but they are all coordinated with each other. That's what's so important. So, what were the issues that were identified by the economic recovery support function? There were 8 major issues. Significant losses to agriculture and aquaculture. Louisiana is a state that is still very much an agricultural state. Aquaculture is also very important. We grow tiny crustaceans that we call crawfish. In most places in English, they say crayfish, but ours are very unique and very different, and they are a very valuable crop. So that's not seafood. That's not caught in the Gulf of Mexico. That's produced through aquaculture. Same thing with a particular type of fish called a catfish that is farmed extensively in Louisiana. So that was a critical issue.
Yeah,
Adverse impact.
just like Rio Grande do Sul, significantly losses,
Exactly.
damages
Yeah,
to
Jay told me that. Yes, absolutely. So adverse impacts to the business community, including uninsured losses. When we talk about losses, and Anna Paula, you know this. Uh, when we talk about losses, not all losses are able to be insured. Some losses are totally unexpected and are above and beyond insurance coverage. So that is a critical issue. Negative impact to the property and sales tax base of affected, again, these sub-state parishes and municipalities. When there's no economic activity going on, how much tax revenue is coming into the city? None.
None.
Or a small percentage, even if there is some activity, a small percentage. The other thing was disruptions in commercial transport. We'll talk we'll have an entire slide about that. Destruction of affordable and overall housing. Well, wait a minute, David, you're economic. What are you talking about housing? Housing is an economic issue. If people cannot have housing, how are they going to go to work?
Exactly. How they going to produce? How can I go to rest and eat? No, it's essential.
Exactly. So what did we do here? We went to the housing recovery support function and we said we want to partner with you, and they said, hallelujah, absolutely, let's partner. The other one was risk for displacement of individuals. Hurricane Katrina caused the population of New Orleans, Louisiana to go from 520,000 people to 50,000 people. 90% of the city had to leave. A lot of them never came back. And the thing that you have to deal with is not that they have to leave. Of course, they have to leave if their home's been destroyed or if they're, but how do you bring them back? How do you create opportunities for them to come back? And I will say with great pride that New Orleans did create a lot of opportunities that both brought a good number of the people that had to be displaced back, but also brought new people. The closure of schools and daycare facilities. Again, wait a minute. That's education. Is it? Yes, it's education, but what does it affect? It affects the economy. Because if their children aren't in school, how are they going to go to work? If their children aren't being kept in a daycare facility or a facility that keeps children, how are they going to go to work? Next slide, please.
David, just before going to the next slide, I think that since we're talking about insurance and losses and damages, would be super nice to listen to Ana Paula. What is her feeling about it, since she's from the insurance sector. And what we're seeing in the news is that this was the major event for insurance in Brazil. So how are you dealing with it, Ana Paula, in the Confederation?
Well, this is real. This is the largest, in loss that we have in insurance sector in Brazil by far. And the problem that we have in right now, it's the episode is still going on. They're not finished.
You still don't know.
We don't know exactly so far, the extent of the losses, the extent of the damage. So it's still, the episode, the trigger, the insurer is still going, is still here. So this is the major problem of that. The other side, that the sector is very wealthy at this moment, so there's no problem, in the reserves. There is no problem, in the products. There is no economic problem. We have they have the ability to pay all the claims that it's probably is gonna be it's still going on for this episode, this crisis, the tragedy that we are facing in the Rio Grande do Sul. But the question is, what the next? So how can we prepare the market? How can we protect the sector? How can we prepare the society for the next? Because there is no question, that it's not about if, it's about when. You know, that's the question. When it's going to happen, you know, and how it's going to happen. So we are facing episodes since the last 10 years in Brazil that they are saying how this is going to happen. And they are very close to each other. And Rio Grande do Sul, it's is the perfect, you know, and the saddest example that we are was a community, was a place can face it, you know. In September of last year, you know, part of Rio Grande do Sul was affected by a huge flood, and now we have a whole state. Never, you know, and I think this is one of the largest, you know, episodes in the flood episode in the world. We are not talking only to Brazil, you know. That's why, you know, all the especially all the climate policies, you know, and their environment leaders and activists, everybody's watching what's happening right now. And so I think, you know, it's gonna be, you know, insurance sector in Brazil, it's really well known about, you know, the risk management, you know, capability. So I think that this is the time, you know, and we have the best minds thinking, you know, together, and together with the, you know, the rest of the society, with the cities, with the, you know, the federal level and the states, you know, with the specialists, with academic, you know, with economists, in order to really to be able to have the right plans, to be able to build the right products, you know, be able to give the right assessment for situations like that.
And Ana Paula, even though you're saying that we have a very nice capacity in insurance sector here in Brazil, how do you feel that this kind of event might change insurance culture, or even risk assessment comprehension? How can we be better on it regarding insurance?
Well,
what are the
I think
lessons that the insurance sector, what are the lessons that the insurance sector might learn from this event?
I think to start to think about the, you know, the rebuild the products. I think it's a key, you know, to have the right product for the population. I think there's something that, you know, suitability is the key, you know, is the key word for that. I think, you know, more than ever, the population understand the need to have protection for their goods, for their houses, for their, you know, their economic capability, you know, and to be able to access the right product. This is the question, you know. Part of the housing insurance that was sold in the South, they don't have, you know, flood covered, you know, and for the several reasons, you know, most of it, you know, they were not expecting, you know, like I don't have flood coverage for my home because I live in a building, but we have, you know, and people from houses from places that never was able to face a flood is facing a flood. So to be able to understand, you know, the exact need of the population, I think it's really, you know, it's really important. Also, you know, the people, you know, like we never, I think, in the history of our country, speak so much about insurance, you know, and they are concerned, you know, you know, the claim word here, David, we call sinistro. It's a word that's in Portuguese is an odd word, you know, because it means something bad. And normally the people doesn't relate this to insurer, you know, the normal people. Only the people that normally buys insurer or something like that. So now everybody's understanding this kind of word, you know. So I think now everybody, you know, I think what we're facing right now in Rio Grande do Sul is we are really facing climate change. So and we need to do something to protect ourselves, our cities, our people, our infrastructure, we need to be able to have something to protect the society. So I think now the population over there, it's really think about it.
David, do you have anything to say regarding insurance?
It's a crisis worldwide. And before we started, Anna, Paula, and I had quite a conversation about the issues facing the insurance industry in the United States. It's really causing a lot of consternation, a lot of heartache and problems, because in certain places, like the place where I live, insurance rates have gotten so extraordinarily high that the state itself had to establish a state funded insurance pool that now I think sits at $180 million, which is a tremendous amount of money for a state that's of 4 million people. So I see this continuing, and I think that Ana Paula has exactly the right view on this. And what I told a very good friend of mine who is an insurance executive, he was with a global insurer, now he's with a specialty insurer. I said the insurance companies need insurance, and resilience is the best insurance that insurance companies can have. And so the insurance industry has gotten very active in the resilience and climate adaptation. Just for clarification, climate adaptation deals with any type of resilience dealing with the climate. There are some actions that are not directly linked to climate change, like earthquakes and volcanoes. Now, there's a lot of theories that they are, but there's no empirical evidence. So when we talk about climate adaptation, we're talking about resilience, but it's dealing with the climate, and that's what you're having in Brazil. That's what we have here in Louisiana. But I think that the insurance industry now is becoming fully engaged in this effort to prevent damage from happening in the first place, because it's in your own best interest, Ana Paula. Your members, their own best interest is to
Exactly.
prevent damage at the scale that we've seen it. Absolutely.
So David, David and Ana Paula, we're going to our last slide, even though we have more of it. We will come back to the other slides in our next live next Tuesday, and I want already to invite everybody for our next live because we already have 1 hour and 15 minutes of conversation here, and so just to make sure that we will do it in the time that we proposed. So we're going for our next slide, and then final considerations, final words.
Well, this is a great slide to stop with, because the slides that follow this detail each one of these 5 major recovery priorities. Okay, so this is a great place to stop based on these issues, and again, in consultation with stakeholders. We identify these issues, and then we went to the stakeholders, to the people that were affected by the disaster, business associations, business leaders, employee groups. In the U.S., as you know, we have unions. We went to all of these stakeholders and said, "Is this what you think is important? This is what you've given us as feedback." And they said, yes. Assisting businesses in reopening and recovery, identifying agriculture and aquaculture net losses and potential resources to assist with recovery and resilience. Again, embedding resilience, identifying financial partners to assist in business triage. And I'll explain what that means next week, but basically identifying those businesses that need help, that aren't fatally injured, because some businesses are, unfortunately, but that could recover with some help. Identifying opportunities to address employee housing. I talked about that already. Addressing transportation and supply chain issues, making them more resilient. At one point, every major transportation system in the state of Louisiana was disabled. The highways, the railways, the ports, the all but the air transportation, it was temporarily halted because of the floods, because some of the airports were flooded.
For how long, David?
The airports, not long. I don't remember exactly. I mean, you're getting into a level of detail I don't
No, I
have right
mean
now,
not the
unfortunately.
airports, but the other
Well, one of the
ports
ports
and
was,
highways.
yeah,
You
one of the
mean
ports, I said
months?
this in the beginning. I said this in the beginning. One of the major inland ports was out of service for over 2 months because the waterway, the navigable waterway that fed that port was damaged. So this is a really important and critical issue with disaster because it can multiply the damages if your transportation is off. It's not just a matter of business; it's a matter of food. How do people get food when the grocery store can't get the food that it needs to resell to people? I mean, these are critical issues, and we'll talk about how we address that in the recovery next week.
David, my last question for you is, so you're always talking about consultation in a local level, in community level. Uh, maybe we will cover this in our next live, but it's very important to understand the methodology, how you did a high quality uh, active listening to 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 the community. So because it's not only a matter of going there and asking, so what do you think about it? What should we do? How you do that in a high level, in a good quality.
That's a you threw me a curveball. Um, I think that what the elements that I've already pointed out to you, if you take those all together, what we would do is we would go to again the people that were affected, the businesses that were affected in our case because we're dealing with the economy. We would bring them together. We would say to them, "Here's what we found. Here are the impacts that we found. Is this in line with what you see? Does this validate what you see the impacts were?" And then we say, here are some things that we have seen that could be priorities for recovery. We just laid those out for you, those five. We tested those off of leaders in every region of the state. We did meetings in regions of the state because each region is different. I'm telling you, I don't pretend to know much about Brazil, but I know that every region and every state and every country in the world has differences. So we would go to every region and say, okay, does this apply to you? Are these the things that you think are priorities? That is how you build ownership. Ownership. It's
But
their priority.
you don't go and ask only for the mayor or for, for the
No,
public sector. You go for the people. You go to
we
the
go to the
businesses.
business, and again, in our case, if we were housing, we would go to the people that were affected, whose houses were destroyed, whose affordable homes were not livable, right? But we were in economics, so we would go to the businesses. We would bring people to meetings that represented business associations, but also individual business owners. We wanted to hear from the people who were directly affected because when we hear from them and then we say, okay, is this what you think would work? And they say yes, guess what? They take in ownership.
Yeah, that is the thing. Okay. So for final words, Ana Paula, please.
Now, again, thank you so much for this invitation. Was really incredible to hear, your experience, David. And I think you brought a word that's the feeling right now. The insurance sector is really fully engaged. I think the view is kind of different, at this moment. Before we were seen as investors, for some ESG or initiatives or something like that. Now we understand that we can and we must do more. we must with products, we must, to be able to produce and help to adaptation, beyond the mitigation, because the mitigation is the core of our business. But we should, and we must, help, the world and the cities, our society to adapt to this new moment that we are facing. And I always see, and Natasha knows that, insurers that are really, as one of the most important pillars to a sustainable society. So and I think it's, now it's the moment, that we should be standing up and to support, our populations, our clients, our insurers, So again, thank you so much. It was a really, really incredible lessons that we received this night.
Thank you, Ana Paula. That was so sweet of you to say. And there's one fact that I said last week that I'll say again. Of all climate investment, only 4% goes toward adaptation. 4%.
Exactly.
This is
insane.
So important and shocking information, David. And I don't think you went to that in our past live, in our last conversation. But this is 4%. So it's 96%.
And listen, I want to interrupt you. I want to interrupt you with apologies. It's critically important that we reduce carbon. Carbon is causing a lot of this. But if we don't adapt to what is already happening and what will happen for decades to come, if we went to carbon zero today, the effects of what's already happened will be with us for centuries. If we don't adapt, we are in real trouble. We're in real trouble.
And these numbers are really shocking, because you're saying 4% for adaptation and resilience, and 96% for mitigation policies. So it's important to really think about it, because during the crisis and the recovery moment, this will make a lot of difference.
Yeah, and don't reduce the amount that's going toward carbon, lowering carbon, removing carbon. Increase the amount that's going toward adaptation. We must.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, David. Thank you, Ana Paula. So switching again into Português. Obrigada a todos vocês que estiveram na nossa live até agora.
Eu espero que essa live tenha sido muito instrutiva, esse exemplo de Louisiana, e como David esteve nesse front, que ele nos sirva de lição, de inspiração para aquilo que a gente pode trazer para o Brasil e implementar aqui. E na próxima terça-feira, já deixo o convite aqui para a nossa próxima live. Nós vamos continuar nesse assunto de Louisiana e também trazer outros assuntos do interesse de recuperação do Rio Grande do Sul e de outras regiões que venham a passar por esse tipo de catástrofe. Obrigada pela presença de todos.